There, does that work? Oh, cool. Okay. So the day's split in two, and I'm going first. If something I said made no sense at all, or you have no clue what I'm talking about, feel free to raise a hand, and I'll try to answer questions as we go. But in general, questions are probably, if they're more general or conceptual, maybe leave them towards the end. First off, the Bay Area is a very unusual place for talking about Wicca because there's such a huge variety of people, level of awareness. How many people here are learning about Wicca for the first time in coming to this talk? One, two, only a couple. That means we're doing our job. We're educating. Good. So I'm still going to give some background info, and some of you may have heard a little bit of it before. My name's Don Frew. I'm a priest of the spiritual path called Neo-Pagan Witchcraft, or Wicca. I'm an elder in two traditions of Wicca, which is kind of like denominations in Christianity. And I'm the high priest of a coven in Berkeley called Coven Trismegiston, which is Greek for Coven of the Thrice Greatest Ones. And I'm a national interfaith representative for the Covenant of the Goddess, which is the largest Wiccan religious organization in the world these days, and one of several national interfaith reps, one of the others being Maka Nightmare, who's sitting right over here, and has been working with the Marine Interfaith Council for some time. The easiest way to get a handle on neo-paganism is to think of something like Native American spirituality, but with a European cultural setting or a Mediterranean cultural setting, coming out of the pre-Christian religions of Europe and the Mediterranean. There are Druids who are reviving Celtic practices of Britain. There are heathens who are taking their inspiration from the Norse myths and Viking culture. There are Egyptian and other kinds of reconstructionists. But by far the majority, the huge majority of modern pagans are what are called witches. And witchcraft comes out of the fusion of Celtic, Anglo-Saxon, and Roman cultures that happened in the British Isles over its long history. This has led many modern witches to use the Anglo-Saxon word Wicca, which is the older form of the word that witch derives from, instead of witchcraft. Many found the word witch just too loaded, carrying too much baggage, especially to tell to your parents, and so would substitute the word Wicca. This has had the unintended benefit that when we travel to other parts of the world, witch can be a really loaded word, especially when it's translated into the local language, but they've never heard of Wicca. And so they just learn about it as some new religion they've never heard of before. And so Wicca is growing by leaps and bounds outside the English-speaking world, much faster, actually, I think, than it is here. When it gets to what is witchcraft or Wicca, things get complicated because there's so many varieties. You'll notice that I almost always will say most witches think this, or witches tend to believe something, because there's so many ways to approach it. Rather than focus on a single belief system or a single practice, we focus on a connection with the divine through the natural world. And through that connection, we develop a relationship with the divine, a gnosis of understanding the divine that we can recognize in each other. And that ties us together much more than particular teachings or particular practices. That being said, most witches will focus on the immanence of the divine, manifest as the natural world, but also as each other, as inanimate objects, what we would normally call inanimate objects like stones, even constructed objects like the table. Some witches will also acknowledge and relate to a transcendent aspect of the divine. Although I have to say that since many witches are coming, well, we're now in a transition where we have a younger generation that's growing up as witches and pagans, as opposed to a generation that's X something else. The older generation that was X something else tends to want to abandon the words of the earlier faith. And so for a lot of witches, transcendent is kind of a dirty word. But that's because they think of it as meaning not immanent, as opposed to things being both transcendent and immanent. So a recognition of the transcendent aspect of the divine is growing within modern Wicca, I think. Almost all witches relate to the divine as the goddess, but many will relate to the divine as a male-female pair of the goddess and the god. There are witches who believe in reincarnation in various forms, some who don't. There are those who assert the reality of the gods as beings of a higher order, while others will say they're just symbols or projections of our own unconscious in some way. Within our own community, you can think any or all of the above even at the same time, and there really isn't a problem. I was surprised within my own tradition called Gardnerian that when someone came to me as a student and professed that she was an atheist, I went on one of our bulletin boards and I asked people, gee, do you think someone could be a Gardnerian and be an atheist? And I immediately got responses from all over the world saying, that's ridiculous. How could someone be a witch and not believe in the gods? And then about the other half of the board responded and said, what's the problem? I'm an atheist, which led to a really interesting discussion online. In terms of practice, almost all of us meet in circles. Almost all witches will celebrate the night of the full moon or as close to it as they can schedule, and observe seasonal holidays that relate to the agricultural and pastoral cycles of our ancestors. Some witches will use liturgies that have been passed down from teacher to student for generations. Others value spontaneity and will create liturgy on the spot as the spirit moves them. That right there is probably one of the main distinctions between the tradition that I come out of and the tradition that Maka comes out of. You might, if you were to use a Christian analog, say that my folks are Jesuits and hers are liberal Protestants, maybe. They've been called Pentecostals, okay. We address our rights to different gods and goddesses. People often develop a personal relationship with a particular deity that's their tutelary deity that will guide them, either through speaking to them in some way, through direct speech or through signs and omens, or just as an example to follow. And we create our rituals around different myth cycles from antiquity, very often from the Celtic, the Greco-Roman, the Egyptian sometimes myth cycles, like the kings of the waxing and waning year, or the cycle of Persephone's descent to the underworld, and other myths as well. So with all that variety, the thing that holds us together really is that sense of gnosis, that sense that someone has had a direct connection with the divine, manifest as and through the natural world. And we recognize that in each other. This was incorporated in the bylaws of the Covenant of the Goddess when right at the beginning we're saying, well, who can be a member? Well, witches. Well, what's a witch? Oh boy, that's going to be fun. And after writing a bunch of simple things like, well, some group meets once a month around the cycle of the moon, things like that, the bottom line was the person identifies themselves as a witch and two other witches known to us say that person's a witch. So we basically put in our bylaws, takes one to know one. And that's really what it's boiled down to. Many of us came to this practice through an experience that's so common that it's got a name. It's called coming home. And for me, it was a long coming home process. For some people, it's a very quick one. But in general, it's one of never feeling at home in the religion in which one's raised, very often Christian, disproportionately Jewish, according to some polls, but feeling like rather than going to a church or a synagogue that you want to go outdoors to speak to the divine, often coming up with one's own rituals, and then only later discovering that there's a whole community of people that are already doing the same thing. And so it doesn't feel like you're converting so much as you're finding a group you were already a part of.